I'm a dentist. I graduated about 3 years ago, 4 years ago, maybe. You know, with the whole pandemic going on, it's kind of my concept of like days and calendars completely gone. Um, but yeah, I work in Birmingham, in Handsworth, which is a really cool area. There's a lot of good food places nearby. And I studied at King's, so I lived in London for about 8 years. I did a degree in neuroscience first, and then I did dentistry. And I kind of got into writing in my second year of dentistry, I think. I'd always kind of been into, I'd always been kind of a visual artist growing up
Mhm.
at a young age. And um, I kind of just fell across sort of the art scene and writing itself, and made some quite good friends within quite a few good friends who are poets, and just kind of took it step by step, sort of open mics, and then eventually getting the chance to actually publish my own collection a couple of years ago. Um, so yeah, yeah, I wouldn't describe it as a double life. I mean, sometimes it does feel like a double life because it just seems like they're completely two different worlds. Like just the vibe of sort of being in the dental practice or working in a hospital compared to sort of the life of an artist. It is
Mhm.
quite difficult to find that balance. Um, but it's interesting. I think it's really important for healthcare professionals, for dentists, for doctors to sort of have interests outside of their field because it's such a stressful job.
Absolutely.
Um, but also, like in terms of just healthcare professionals, doctors working on the front line, you know, we deal with humans, and a lot of my work, a lot of artists out there, their role is in a way to kind of convey the human experience. And I feel like a lot of the time, you know, we're at the front line, we are dealing with people, we are not managing people, but we are interacting with people on a daily basis when they are at their most vulnerable, when they are at their most human. So we kind of get to see a different aspect of humanity. So I think that's a really interesting thing to be able to put down in words, or put down in, you know,
Mhm.
whatever art form you kind of choose. It's really cool that you do this with healthcare professionals. I've kind of been looking through some of
Yeah.
your but there's a lot of healthcare professionals out there that do kind of lead this double life.
Mm. And I mean, what I'm passionate about is I make jokes about this whole double life. It kind of reminds me of Hannah Montana. Um, side note, but I really don't want it to be a double life. Like my hope for medical education is just that we stop siloing off the arts and science, and it really becomes more of the norm. I mean, I'm coming from a very biased place because I integrated in medical humanities and creative arts,
Oh,
and
wow.
so that was a really wonderful experience because that was me. I actually did it between years 3 and 4. So I'd done 1 year of clinical medicine, and
Hmm.
then I decided that I wanted to integrate in something that I never really get the chance to spend as much time on when I start, real working life, which is now for me August.
Hmm.
And so doing this degree was really eye-opening because it was the first time that you were no longer just kind of a cog in this huge system that's, the NHS, but you were actually asked around your individual responses and opinions to literature, to film, to art. And it was the first time that there was no right answer. And I think
Hmm.
that is such a powerful thing. And, as you know, with like dentistry exams, my best mate who I lived with at uni was a dentist. Like, it's the same with medicine. It is just so much to learn, so much knowledge to consume, and it's all about the right answer. And
Hmm.
I think the arts can be such a wonderful vehicle in expressing uncertainty, dealing with uncertainty, and all that there is. And I really hope, and throughout this conversation, I'm sure there'll be pearls of wisdom to show people that it really can be brought together within, a medical dentistry or any sort of, highly professional degree.
Hmm. Definitely, definitely.
Yeah. So let's strip it back and take it to the start. So you did neuroscience first, and then you fell into dentistry. So tell us a little bit about that. How did you get into dentistry, and yeah, what attracted you towards it?
So initially when I did neuroscience, I was actually on the path of like becoming a medical doctor. I was kind of sort of like the idea. Uh, I'd always kind of been a bit of a kind of lateral thinker. I had a passion for science and healthcare, but at the same time, you know, there was that aspect of me that really enjoyed reading, that really enjoyed writing, that really enjoyed conveying sort of themes through my hands and through paint and through drawings, that kind of thing. And when it came to kind of deciding on a career, I find it quite difficult to find something that I kind of would predict would give me
Mm-hmm.
uh, make me feel fulfilled. And I think it's quite a big decision to ask, you know, a 16-year-old
Yeah.
or a 17-year-old, because, you know, no one knows, no one really, well, you kind of have to gauge sort of what your skills are, what you kind of like roughly based on what your GCSEs are, based on what your hobbies are. But I remember just struggling at that age, and because I was thinking, okay, well, you know, there's an aspect of medicine that I really like. Like I remember when I was in, I think I was 15, I broke my ankle in like 2 or 3 places, and I was had quite a big surgery, and
Mm.
I had a cast for like a few months, and I couldn't even go to school because
Wow.
my school was quite a distance away, so there was no way of me to really like travel back and forth. So I ended up going to a school within the hospital, and I remember, I look back actually now and just think the amount of support, the amount of the reliance that I had on those doctors and sort of their ability to take me from being this, you know, someone who wasn't even able to put weight on one leg to, you know, be able to have like a functioning normal life. And just the amount of fear that you have from the patient's perspective, the amount of the uncertainty that you have, to be able to kind of be someone's crutch in that position and to offer them that support. I just always had an appreciation for healthcare from then on. Um, and I don't know, I think there was an aspect of surgery as well, which I thought was sort of artistic, and people would kind of tell me, oh, it's, you know, if you're into arts, like, you know, you'd really be good at
Mm.
becoming a surgeon. Or, but, you know, I was the first in my generation to get a degree. So it was sort of, a lot of it was sort of hearsay. Like you hear, when it comes to careers, it's based on kind of what the idea of that is. You have no real insight. I did some work experience at GPs. I did some work experience at dentists. I didn't really like the idea of dentistry initially. I remember one of my good mates at the time, when I was kind of really pro doing medicine, he was on the path to doing dentistry, and we used to kind of take the piss out of each other.
Yeah.
Yeah, because he would just be like, "Oh, you know, all the negative aspects and the fears that you have of being a doctor," like he would kind of throw that at me, and I would just be like, well, you know, you're just looking at people's mouths and cleaning their teeth, like what is that? But again, I didn't know anything about what it was. So I ended up not getting the A-level results that I wanted, partly because I put too much work on my plate. I ended up I really had this idea in my head that I was gonna do A-levels within 1 year. So I did like a full A2 within 1 year
Oh my gosh.
in my
What?
spare time. Yeah, thinking that the A level would be this easy thing that I could do.
Wow.
Um, and it ended up just messing up the rest of the. And I remember the head of the sixth form was like, "You're not going to be able to do this." I was like, "No, I'm going to prove you right. I'm going to prove you wrong." But I ended up proving it right. So then I just thought, okay, well, back then, you know, university fees were like 3 grand, and it was quite a normal thing to just, you know, do an undergrad degree and then maybe apply for medicine as a postgrad. Um, and then I think about halfway through the degree, because I was interacting with a lot of medics and interacting with a lot of dentists, I'd kind of pick up things and just hear about kind of what their day-to-day was like and what studying those
Mm.
degrees was like. And I really just like the idea of a dentist just having that much autonomy over a patient's care, you know, from start to finish. So, you know, you're seeing patients when they're children, you're you're seeing them when they're in pain and getting them out of pain, but you're also seeing them, you know, when they just want to have a general checkup, and you're really getting to know your patient on a level where maybe I would compare it in terms of GP, in terms of medicine, as kind of the level of a GP, but then at the same time, the level of a GP would be, you know, there's the lack of sort of surgery
Mm.
and just hearing how, you know, you could be with the patient in really different aspects and um, have like a variation of skills from, you know, when it comes to just physically being able to do surgeries, you know, within different clinical specialties, and really getting good as well. That's the other thing, because I always thought if I was going to do medicine, I'd probably want to become a surgeon. But one thing that put me off surgery or going
Mm-hmm.
down that path was I felt like, if because you literally have people's lives in your hand.
Yeah.
I mean, dentistry, you know, you have a lot of responsibility, but you're very rarely in a position where someone's, you know, life is literally in your hands. And I felt if I was to take on responsibility of that, I would have to devote so much of my life to it. And again, because I had that thing of, you know, different things sort of different things motivate me. I found that if I wanted to be a great doctor, I'd have to really put my all into it, and I wasn't sure if I'm willing to put my all into it. Whereas when I was hearing about, the lifestyle of a dentist, just the ability to be able to do your job well and get good at it and become kind of an expert in very niche things, but then be able to, have the time and the freedom to be able to do other things. I found that was quite appealing. And I did some work experience. I just really liked the dynamic that the patient had with the dentist, and yeah, just sort of took it from there. And kind of, I'm not going to lie, there are times where you just think, what, I don't know if this was the career for me, but I think everyone goes through that.
Sure.
I think everyone has that phase. But I did know that I didn't want my job to be the only thing that kind of gives me fulfillment. As much as it's amazing being a medic, or it's amazing being a dentist in terms of what you can do for other people. I didn't want my job to be kind of my whole life. And I think that's a really good thing about dentistry, is that you can switch off. Like, you can go to work, you can do your all, and then you can leave and you can switch off. Whereas I remember I was doing I did a MaxFax post recently. So that's where dentists kind of work as SHOs, senior in MaxFax, and that sort of, for me, when I got that position, I thought, oh, you know what, that itch of what it's like to be a medic, I can really kind of get that actual insight, and I really, really did enjoy it. I really did find it fulfilling. But there's certain aspects of it I was like, you know what, I'm happy being a dentist. Though, working in,
did it make you really confirm that, yeah, I made the right decision? I feel knackered.
No, definitely. I mean, it was great. I really enjoyed it. But I just remember how draining it was, especially because from a dental point of view, we don't have experience working in hospitals. We've never, yes, there are some translatable skills, but a lot of it, 90% of it was just, you just learn on the job. You just get in there and get stuck. And I remember just thinking, there's so many times where things could have gone horribly wrong. And you just think, I'm really glad to have made it through. But at the same time, it's kind of like a boot camp. You're just thrown into it, and you just make do with it.
You're thrown in the deep end and you learn on the job. I mean, I've got this all to come, fun and games. My junior doctor days start in August, so I've got to really, really hype myself up for that. No more student life. Yeah.
How are you? Is there aspects of it that you're kind of worried about, especially like during the pandemic? I can imagine everything's kind of all up in the air, though.
Yeah, it's actually a weird one. So I'm basically finished medical school now. So I'm at Bristol, and we do our finals before Christmas. So luckily we've all kind of finished finals, and we finished our last ever placement. So I came back home last Friday, and all I've got left now is an elective. And usually, as I'm sure you remember with your medic mates, an elective is when you go with your mates and you get signed off and you go traveling. But obviously, because of pandemic, that is not the case. So it's kind of been a weird anticlimactic year of lots of uncertainties and just kind of lots of different changes. But it's the same that what happened with the year above us last year. The year above us didn't get a graduation, they didn't get their elective, and then they also had to be foundation interim doctors, so they actually had to start work during their elective. So right about now, in the first lockdown last year, they had already started working in the NHS, whereas with us, we do have that luxury of still being able to do an elective, and we start in August. Do I feel anxious about it? I actually think I feel less anxious in a really weird way than I probably would have had I gone on some big jolly traveling around, and forgetting about the medical world. And because we've been so immersed in it since September, and we've not been on the front line per se, but we've been, observing colleagues, helping colleagues, doing assistantships, really, trying to help wherever we can rather than be lemons on the ward. It's made me see what the realities are. And from the chats I've had with various junior doctors, I feel much more prepared in a weird way than I think I would have had there not been a pandemic, because I think the pandemics allow people to be a lot more open with communication and what they're struggling with, and talking about the mental health and kind of well-being piece of having a really stressful job. So I feel like Yeah, I feel a bit more mentally prepared, just because I believe that we will have support compared to a lot of my seniors who are thrown in the deep end and are
Yeah.
just told to get on with it, if you get me.
Mhm.
But yeah, no, it'll be interesting, new chapter of my life. But anyways, back to you, because you're more exciting. Tell us when you first got that kind of creative kind of kick in you. Was it at school? How did that translate into kind of your interests? Were you doing it for enjoyment? Any creative activities? And then, how did that carry on with you into where you're at now?
So I think the first creative kick I ever had was probably when I was in year three. We're going all the way back. And one of my teacher at the time, Miss Lockyer, she'd given us all the task of drawing sycamore seeds. Um,
Yeah.
so we were all kind of just drawing it. And I think I was just spending time I found it quite relaxing, just spending time and just noticing the details. And I was drawing it with
Mm.
pencils. And then randomly, like we were allowed to kind of sit around. Back in the day in school, like there would just be certain periods that I think, looking back, it was probably just like the teacher just couldn't be asked. I'm just like, yeah, you know what, you all do your thing. And I'm just gonna sit here and draw.
Self-directed
Yeah,
work. I
yeah.
love that. Yeah.
Um, and I remember drawing like the pattern of kind of a wood grain on a cupboard, and then I showed it to her, and she just like she I really wish I had the picture, because I don't know what she was talking about, but she was just really praising me, and she was just saying, "Wow, this is like the best thing I've ever seen." I think she probably thought I was like a prodigy or something at that age, because she might
Wow.
have just been used to a lot of the other year three kids just sort of kind of drawing it in a certain way, but I'd kind of put so much detail into it. And then even I remember at the recent, so not long after that, sort of like a parents' evening, and then she had the picture and she showed it to my parents,
Yeah.
and she said, I think she said something along the lines of, she was like, "Oh, I've seen university students draw things, and this is better than some of the stuff that they've done." And my parents were completely shocked, because they were just like, "Oh, like, you're gonna be like, you're some genius." Like, it was completely overrated, like I look back now. But I remember my parents sort of from then sort of, they really put an effort into, just like anytime I'd get like a birthday, they'd all just get me art supplies. Sort of once kind of the one thing that a kid likes, it's really easy to get them birthday presents. And also, it was just quite a chill thing for me to just stay indoors. And we kind of lived sort of growing up childhood wise. I think my parents didn't really like us going out too much. Like, we had a park near us, but they didn't like the idea of us sort of hanging around the roads and that kind of stuff. And it was sort of seen as this sort of really safe hobby that you can just stay at home
Yeah.
and just draw. And they sort of encouraged me to do it, because it was just sort of, it was an easy thing. I just sit there and do my own thing, and
Yeah.
easily managed. And then I just sort of became a doodler. Like, as time would go on, I would just doodle, and I sort of just became known as like the guy that was really good at art in school. And then, like, sort of in secondary school, I just like really liked drawing, like art, GCSE, painting. I really liked.
Mm.
Um, there was a year where our tutor, our sort of, how you used to have, what was it called? When they do the register, like,
Yeah, the form teacher.
yeah, it's a
Yeah.
form tutor. Yeah. So our form tutor room was in the art room. No, well, so
Okay.
our year eight form tutor room was in the music room, and
Okay.
then our year 10 form tutor room was in the art room. Which is, I look back and think that's actually really strange. But I don't know, like, I just sort of had been around, and sort of music. Like, I always had like, uh, I really liked lyricism. I always
Yeah.
paid attention to kind of lyrics itself. Um, and yeah, I mean, I'd always kind of seen it as a hobby, to be honest.
Mm.
I always saw it as this thing that I do to relax. I don't do it all the time. I think a lot of people think, once you sort of identify as an artist or a poet, like, people just assume that you're doing that all the time. But there'll just be huge periods of time where you're not. You're just carrying on with life, and then randomly you'll just feel the need, or to write about something, or to kind of relax. And in terms of how I got into writing specifically, so I was in second year of dentistry, and a friend of mine who I used to work with, they said they had tickets to an event, and I was revising. And I remember the day, it was really sunny outside, and I kind of just wanted any excuse to stop
Yeah.
revising. I was just
I
kind of
know the
sick of it.
feeling.
Yeah, and so as soon as someone gives you an hour, it's like, yep, I'll take that. And they had tickets for this event, which called Level Up in Birmingham. And I went to it, and it was the first time I'd ever seen anything like that. I'd never seen spoken word prior to that. Um, and with Level Up, you know, there's a poet called Polar Bear who's relatively famous in the sort of spoken word scene. He's from Birmingham and he lives in London, and he basically did his performance. Prior to that, there was an open mic, and I remember there were these sort of 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds going up there and sort of reciting their poems and I remember just finding it very captivating and really listening to what they were saying and how little things like, you know, the movement of their hands and the tone in which they say things and the emphasis that they put on certain words and just the stories that they had to tell. I just remember thinking at 16, 17, I was not thinking on this wavelength. I would not have even had the confidence of, you know, to go on stage and sort of, and, you know, speak to a crowd of people in that way, you know, and show that vulnerability about, you know, poems that you've written. It would have been something that I would have thought was my worst nightmare. And I remember at the time just kind of being in awe of it and really enjoying it. And you know, when you go to certain events or you experience something that really just makes your brain, like the cogs in your brain, start to work. And my friend's friend, she's a poet, and she was running a Gold Arts Award. And in second year of dentistry, you actually have the longest summer holidays that you're going to have for the whole degree, pretty much. I think it's like 8 weeks, and then any time after that it goes down to like 4 weeks, 3 weeks, 2 weeks, until the final year where you have like a week off your holidays and you start the following year. It's crazy.
Growing up is the worst.
Yeah, like, or just you know,
Yeah.
say with my first degree, you know, we had like 2-3 month holidays.
No, I
in
know
between.
that's what happens when you don't go for a vocational degree and people aren't expecting you to actually get skills to help society. Yeah. You can just have a whole long summer holiday.
Yeah, your time's gone basically. But at least you get your degree's money worth.
Yeah.
And so she said, she mentioned something about running a Gold Arts Award. And I mentioned to her, my friend said, oh, he's really good at drawing. And she said, oh, well, why don't you do this Gold Arts Award? It's usually like £600, but it's, you know, you can get it for free. I was like, oh, okay, why not? And I thought, because I've got 2 months off, and, you know, eventually in summer holidays, you kind of get bored, especially if you're broke and you don't have a car, that kind of thing. So I thought, yeah, you know what, I'll do it. And part of the Gold Arts was really good in terms of, you know, you get to work with other people who are interested in the arts, and, you know, you go to all these events, you go to all these galleries, and you have to write responses to them. And for someone who's kind of interested in the arts but doesn't know a way of kind of getting in, it's a nice little stepping stone. And part of it is that there's a module in experimentation, and because that experience of going to Level Up and writing, I'd always kind of thought of it. I thought, experimentation, why not do poetry, why not do spoken word? And this organization called Beauty Freaks in Birmingham, who works with a lot of young people, they were doing this sort of summer academy, a week-long summer academy. I thought, oh, you know what, I'll sign up for that. I'll sign up for the poetry, spoken word aspect of it, and then that can contribute to the Gold Arts Award. And I got to work with a really good friend of mine now, actually. But there's a poet called Nafisa Hamid, who is amazing. Her work is great. And she was quite young at the time. I was quite young at the time. So we were working together. Well, the theme in terms of writing was identity. So I was writing about just, you know, growing up and being a British Pakistani Muslim, and she was writing about being a British Pakistani Muslim. So they just said, oh, why don't you two do a collaboration? Amazing. And so we got to work with each other, and she had a lot more experience than me, so I kind of was picking up things as we were going along in terms of performance. And at the end of the week, you know, there was a showcase on an actual stage. So, you know, there was the poetry team, there was the dance team, there was a music team, and it was just ended up being this sort of showcase. And me and Nafisa did our piece together, and like it just got like standing ovations, and everyone really loved it. And they said, oh, well, you should come and perform at this open mic night. And then we just started going to open mic nights and started writing new things, and it just sort of kind of went from there. The art scene is very, very nice place. It's a very inclusive place. You find a lot of artists are very willing to kind of listen to each other's works, and very, very, very willing to offer critique and support each other. And, you know, collaborations as well. Like, you know, it's a very normal thing for, you know, you can meet someone on open mic night who's who's maybe a guitarist, and they see you perform and they say, oh, why don't we work together, why don't we come up with a piece together, and people will just be on it. I don't know if that's just a Birmingham thing though, or if that's a general thing, because the Birmingham scene is quite, Birminghamese tend to be quite friendly. And yeah, like I just got to work with different organizations. And then in terms of writing the book, I've been approached by someone I knew who was an artist who had set up this publishing house, which was the ethos behind it was very much kind of showcasing Birmingham art and Birmingham creatives, because it's like anything, a lot of the art world revolves around London, because you do have that degree of elitism. So all the funding and all the the major international spaces tend to be in London, and which, as someone who's living in London, I always found that a bit interesting. And I always found the vibes, of open mic nights in Birmingham compared to London very, very different. And the press itself, it really kind of believed in Birmingham-based artists. So Nafisa actually got published way before I did, by the poetry press. And yeah, so I was just kind of really gassed when they asked me. I just thought, oh, I thought it was a hobby. I never thought I'd be in a position to write a book, or if I was in a position to write a book, I always thought it would be years and years and years from now. Yeah, so I kind of set myself 6 months to do it. Didn't work out in 6 months.
And this is all whilst in dental school?
No. So this was all whilst doing my foundation. So this was after the foundation year of dentistry,
right?
And it was in So it was in the foundation year of dentistry actually that I was doing most of the writing, and the book launch was actually in my first week of Max Facts.
Wow, gosh.
Yeah, so I remember just being in the hospital and then rushing straight to Waterstones for the book launch, and being really stressed because, again, it's just these completely two different worlds.
Completely, from what you're describing.
And when you're in the hospital, I remember my first week of Max Facts was horrible as well. So I remember just feeling really, really stressed, and just like getting to Waterstones and seeing my book for the first time, and then I had to like take the book and go into like the back and just stare at it for a second and be like, wow, oh my god, I can't believe.
Go on, show us.
Oh yeah, and I got to be able to do the illustrations as well. So I remember from the beginning, because they knew
it really was just the best of both worlds for you. You really put your whole kind of heart and soul and your entire creative spin on it. I didn't realize that aspect. That's wonderful.
No, and I really like that the press kind of gave me the sort of freedom to be able to do that. And yeah, I remember just performing, and I still remember that night. It was an amazing night. But again, like, it's very difficult because after you launch a book, you're expected to go on tour. You're expected to kind of go to gigs and book gigs, and I remember, in hindsight, it was probably the worst time to launch the book, because again, Max Facts took so much time up. And you just have no energy. You would have no energy to be able to go to events and sort of give it your all. Sorry, I'm just going to put this on charge.
No worries. Yeah, it does sound like you really were quite overstretched, and that's why I kind of wanted to ask you about just how you dealt with the balance between the two, and if you can just tell us a little bit about that. What was it like stepping in from one world to another, and what similarities do you think there are, and what differences are the things that, what's most striking to you?
Okay, so I'm probably not a good example of someone who can balance it, because personally, I feel like I keep them very, very separate, very, very separate, to the point where, like, okay, in dental school, people knew that I wrote and performed at events, but that's because they'd literally gone to the events and seen me perform. I never really talked to dentists about it. I know it sounds really weird, to kind of have that for me, it's compartmentalization, because I can kind of go between those two worlds, and I kind of like that those worlds are separate. And I feel like if the worlds were sort of the same and merged, you wouldn't feel that escapism. You wouldn't feel that level of escape. And like, to the point where I would never go and tell people. Like, even people had to find out that I'd published the book through sort of like social media, and then they'd ask me, I'd be like, oh yeah, but then I wouldn't talk about it. I remember I look back and I remember one of my colleagues, one of my SHO colleagues, had added me on Facebook, and they'd seen all this stuff to do with the book. And then we went to a morning handover, and they'd said, "Oh my God, I didn't know you were a poet. I didn't know that you had a book. That's so surprising." And then she said, she goes, "Why don't you do why don't you do a performance right here, right now?" And I remember just thinking, what? And at this handover, at this handover with the consultants, that's. I remember just thinking, okay, and I'd come across a lot of dentists who kind of did that. They were like, "Oh, I didn't know you're a poet. Like, why don't you do something right now?" And they
You're not a performing monkey.
I'd literally say, that's exactly the same thing I would say back to them. I think they just thought like maybe it was similar to like being like a rapper or being an MC and just being able to like spit bars like just there and then. Um, but I remember just thinking, no, yeah, you have to be in a kind of certain mind frame, mentally, but also in a way, kind of emotionally. And it's one of those things where you can't. I mean, me personally, like I can't just like switch on and do a performance there and then on the street, like you know what I mean. Like it's just and yes, I'd keep it separate. And like people will hear about it, but then I mean, I might mention things like if people ask, what were you up to on the weekend? I say, oh yeah, I went to this event, I performed at an event. But I don't go into too much detail. But even when it comes to the book, like a lot of people will say, well, what's the book about? But it's quite a difficult thing to kind of sum up what the book is about, especially because there's like 5, 6 different themes. And also, how do I convey? I mean, I know like medics and dentists are supposed to be really good communicators, being able to simplify complex things into something that like everyday jargon. But I find that quite difficult as well when it comes to describing what the book is about, what the themes of the book are about, especially because a lot of the themes are things that you kind of have to live that life to be able to understand some of the stuff. So when it comes to things like talking about Islam and talking about racism or talking about things that are happening internationally in Palestine, Syria, that kind of thing. It's not the kind of thing that you can just pop up into a 2-minute conversation and give a soundbite to. And also the other thing is you have to kind of gauge whether that person is actually interested in the subject, in the content of what you're going to say. Because if you do talk about it, it's not something that you can just sum up in 3 or 4 words and the person go, oh, cool. And so I think that's one of the reasons why I don't. And in a way, it might come to my detriment sometimes. But in terms of how it crosses over, I've learned that a lot of the stories and a lot of the a lot of my patients will inspire me when it comes to certain stories. A lot of my pieces are about me, but occasionally, you know, as you'll get different types of writers. Sometimes people will write from the perspective of in a way fiction, but based on fact. And I find there's certain aspects when it comes to character building that I will take inspiration from my patients, and they probably won't realize it, which is interesting. The other thing is, I've always been an observer. I've always observed people, even when it comes to say me traveling. Like I'd love to.
People watching is actually the best. Yeah, I know. I love people.
It really is. And I remember I only recently got a car. And one of the reasons, which I think people found crazy, was one of the reasons why I didn't want to get a car is because even though the bus can be inconvenient, you kind of interact with people. Not that I go and just randomly talk to people on the bus, but even just watching them, watching their everyday lives, like you kind of imagine, well, what's their life, what are they doing today, where did they just come from, oh, they've got bags in their hands, oh, what are they planning, like, is there a birthday coming up? And it's just stuff like that. Like I find it kind of stimulating, whereas when you're driving kind of in your car, you don't get that, unless it's just, you know, you getting annoyed at other drivers who've cut your lane or something. But the most I interact with people will actually be my patients, because, you know, when you've left work, okay, yes, it's your friends and your family, but that's a certain number of people, but you're seeing patients day in, day out. And yeah, like just talking to them and hearing their stories, I find that quite inspiring.
And in terms of just going into what you said, I really want to talk about and zoom in on what you said about not talking about the details to your colleagues. And it might be a bit of a difficult question to ask, but I'm curious whether you think, because, you know, the book, so I've read online about it, you know, obviously doing my research before talking to you, and you talk about things like masculinity, racism, being, you know, Islam, etc. Do you feel like even being vulnerable is really useful for the artistic world, because vulnerability leads to so much creativity, and it's about the human experience. So when you write, when you create, you know, it's to relate with other people. But do you think in the kind of medical healthcare world that when you show that vulnerability, and if you were to say, oh, my book's about identity, it's about the challenging issues that I have around racism, about being first generation or
Yeah.
whatever it is, do you feel like that's giving away too much? Do you feel that that could be you know, sharing too much with colleagues who you have a professional relationship with? Do you find that kind of a little bit, there's a bit of discomfort with that?
100%. Yeah,
Mm.
100%. Especially because I know a lot of medics, I know a lot of dentists, and I'm not saying they're all the same because but there's a certain aspect. I think there's a certain characteristic that a lot of medics and a lot of dentists share in terms of like we tend to be very logical, and when it comes to discussing things that aren't taught to us, say in a curriculum. I think we find it difficult to kind of talk about the nuances of certain things,
Completely.
and also in general when it comes to discussing things like white supremacy or talking about racism, it's something that a lot of science orientated students, because you know a lot of medics, you know, if we think medics as students, lifelong students,
Mm.
it's when it comes to the arts and the way information is written down in the arts compared to science, and it's come from a scholastic viewpoint, I think we become, in general, as medics or healthcare professionals, we can become very um, uh, flippant when it comes to information modalities that are outside of that,
Yeah,
and sort of
it's very
cause,
elitist. You know, you become dismissive
yeah,
over wanting to get your information from a scientific journal versus a piece of artwork. Why should they have
yeah.
different credibility?
Mhm. And also in terms of what we value as a good use of our time. I think a lot of medics would. Sorry, this is going to sound like really. This is going to sound like I'm judging medics, but I think a lot of people in our field would uh, we're very functional. We think, okay, what's the most we can do with our time? And how is everything useful? It's like every minute of every hour has a use, and even when we're relaxing, we are relaxing within sort of a time frame that we allow ourselves. And the idea of just sitting and, you know, looking at a piece, like looking at a drawing or looking at a painting and sort of discussing it, or like, I don't know, I think it's just outside of the remit of what a lot of medics find enjoyable. But I think that's partially because of the curriculum. It's sort of what we're taught as valuable. You know, that has an effect. We internalize that. So if someone is really good at maths, really good at science, and you know we're at a school where or where we're in it, where we're doing well in an education system which tells us that the arts, that theatre, that music is just this thing that is, you know, a hobby. Like it's fine as a hobby, but it's not a credible career. It's not even as useful as say being a surgeon. And I think a lot of medics, a lot of healthcare professionals, we think that the only way that we can save people is by saving their life. The only way we can help people is by it becoming this life or death situation. But then, you know, I think the arts itself is, you know, offers so much support, even from a mental health point of view. It offers so much support to people out there. From a communication point of view, it allows people to kind of give that. And even when it comes to things like art therapy, um, I am hopeful in the future that as much as art therapy and things like that are useful. Again, we're coming back to use. We're coming back to everything having a use, and I feel like life is more than just having a function.
Mm.
I think a lot of us kind of buy into this sort of capitalistic notion of our worth is how useful we are to the system. And one thing I like about art is it allows you to connect to other people, but also it's completely fine for you to and for you to just sit and observe and comment on the human experience.
Mhm.
Um, I think that's why this might be a bit of a difficulty to discuss that with a lot of medics
Mm. I
or
think
healthcare
it's
professionals.
so interesting what you touch upon. It's something I've obviously observed myself because I was in the minority in wanting to do my intercalated degree in medical humanities and creative arts. was the title of the BSc, whereas, you know, a lot of my friends are doing pharmacology or physiology or biochemistry, things that will be useful for them as future clinicians. But for me, because I'm passionate about pursuing a career in psychiatry, and I know my main tool is going to be my communication, and I know that one of the most profound ways to communicate with someone, especially when you don't have their lived experience but you want to help them, is the arts. And I think the arts can be that brilliant vehicle. It can really express uncertainty, it can express the nuance that science can't necessarily do. And what you were saying about the kind of usefulness and art therapy is really interesting, because I think for all these things to get into the NHS, and I'm so glad to see more and more kind of holistic healthcare coming through, and things like social prescription and art classes in the community and all of that kind of being given value. Things have to be measurable, because things also come into an economic framework as well. And for things to be measurable and for you to get data to then scale things up, it's really hard to not then put it in a very rigid framework. And unfortunately, to do that with art is a shame, and it becomes, you know, it just becomes what it shouldn't be. I actually found that when I did my degree, I enjoyed it less and less. I really loved it overall. It's like one of the best learning experiences ever to take a year out of clinical medicine, but it made me realize how much I prefer it as a hobby than as a degree. So when I was, you know, writing essays around the films that are about, you know, so we did, it was really interesting to read. So we did 3 modules. It was the body, the mind, and death and dying. And within those 3 modules, we looked at topical issues, you know, for instance, around the stigma behind mental illness, for instance. And we looked at it through the lens of creative arts, medical humanities, so looking at literature, history of medicine, like the kind of formation of mental asylums and how, you know, mental health care is structured, how it is. And there was also a law and philosophy element in the degree as well. So we looked at the Mental Health Act and then the mind-body problem and all of that. So we were looking at all these issues, but through different disciplines, which I think is so interesting. Because it's so important to not just come from one school of thought, because then you become closed-minded and it makes you less creative with finding solutions. But the minute I started, I was so interested, and then the minute I started writing essays on it and then doing the exams on it, which they have to do because it's an intercalated degree, but for medical students, so it counts towards your medical degree. So in order it to be measurable and count towards it, the exams, I felt, made me actually start to like the degree less and less, and it became more of a chore than a hobby and a fulfilling activity. And that's something I wanted to actually touch upon with you when you were talking about doing art throughout school, and how much you enjoyed it, you know, when you were at home doing it as an activity, you know, drawing, getting all your birthday gifts around it. You know, what was the difference for you between the assessment element of art and you, Kamil, doing art as a hobby? Because I know for me now, and you may not feel the same, I'm so much more inclined to just do it for a hobby than go and try and do like any sort of assessed degree in it.
So so based on, I just want to pick up on something that you just said. One thing I was thinking is, the other thing is, how do we value kind of not just use but intellect? Because I think when it comes to we're very used as healthcare professionals to of seeing kind of science and maths as sort of being this the kind of epitome of intelligence, and it's almost like, you know, you can't be a genius in art. What you say cannot be highly intellectual when commenting on the history of art. And I think I find it difficult as soon as someone puts a grade or a quantification on something that I feel shouldn't be quantified. That I feel like there's sort of a spiritual aspect when it comes to art, and it's sort of how do you convey someone's spiritual connection to the art, or their emotional connection to the art, through something that can be graded. And I find that's one thing that I have a problem with, is sort of how capitalism has sort of pervaded our education system and what we value as education within a certain time frame. Because I find the education we are in, it's designed to make us useful to the system, and it's sort of, well, what is education beyond that? And I think the big difference between me, doing it as a hobby and me doing it as GCSE is time limits and the limit of. I feel like we limit ourselves when we apply to a curriculum where we think, how am I going to get the best grade? Or how am I going to be able to convey this in a way which shows logical thinking and so again intelligence? And I mean, I enjoyed both. There were certain aspects that I enjoyed because, say within GCSE or say within A level, there might be a certain uh, a skill that I would pick up or something that I didn't know before, which someone else had taught me, and it wasn't something that I had just kind of stumbled on. Which I think when you're doing it at home, when you're doing it within your own time, you tend to stumble, but I think that's part of the learning process. I think within the framework of the curriculum, you're not afforded that time to stumble
Mm-hmm.
because it's, well, stumbling's taken too long and just everyone's stumbling in different ways. But how do we put it in a way, like, I just find it difficult to kind of to grade someone's art or to have value of someone's art, because for me it's unquantifiable in a way. And so, well, who are you as a person to be able to grade my art? Who is anyone, like,
Mm-hmm.
as a person to grade anyone? And I but at the same time, as someone who is kind of a bit kind of wishy-washy and a bit, there is certain aspects of doing it within a curriculum that can be positive
Mm-hmm.
in terms of getting me to a stage. Like, for example, if I wasn't very regimented when it comes to writing the book, it probably would have taken 2 or 3 years.
Sure.
So I did kind of have to push myself,
Mm-hmm.
and but again, there's a balance that comes with it.
Mm. And weird question, but how do you feel when you look at the reviews you get for the book? Because we're talking about grading and who is someone to grade art, or kind of adds their own personal opinion to it. But that is what art is. So many people critique it, and because it becomes commercial, like a book, it kind of survives on reviews and critiques. So how do you feel when you look at the reviews? Do you look at them? What does it, what kind of emotions does it conjure up for you?
Um, I mean, it depends on the review. I mean, I don't tend to get many bad reviews, but
That's
um,
that's what
but,
we want.
but that's more so because it's quite a niche. I feel like the book itself is sort of not made for everyone. I never expected it to kind of sell well. But to people who have read it and said really good things, I find the most rewarding thing is when people who have had kind of a similar lived experience, who didn't think the world of literature was for them, or had never seen books that kind of spoke in their own native languages or could capture a certain time that they feel familiar with. I find that really rewarding. You'll see it sometimes in the reviews. I do sometimes read the reviews where, anyone can say, oh, it's a really good book, you should buy it. But when someone's talking about, oh, that experience or that poem about this really made me think about this, that itself is rewarding, because I think the best compliment is that, oh, your piece made me think about this, or your piece made me feel this about this. And I think that's what art is. If the art stimulates you to think or feel about something,
That is so
it's
fulfilling.
been it's
Yeah.
successful. Yeah, and it really is. um Compared to just, oh, well, this is good. Like, if I look at kind of the artists that I look up to, there's a certain aspect of you feel connected to their work, because even though you might not be able to 100% relate to a piece that they've done or a lived experience that they've had, there will be certain glimmers of it. There will be certain angles, certain lines of it that really stick out to you, and in a way sort of allow you to kind of go down a train of thought that you never would have gone down. And I think that's what's great about it. Art is stimulating in that sense, but if you allow yourself to be stimulated, it can actually help you grow. It helps your brain grow.
Mm. And just touching upon one of the themes that I'm really fascinated by within your art, and that's around masculinity. And I think it's just really telling by the title of your book being Mute Men. Can you just touch a little bit upon about how you think that art can sometimes be a little bit gendered? I mean, I find it fascinating how, when you look back to Emily Dickinson and that era, women weren't actually allowed to write books, write literature, write poetry under their own name. It had to be around men because it was only great white men allowed to publish. And then more and more we've got into the kind of 21st century where the male mind is kind of associated with things like physics and engineering and maths, and then the female mind is like the wishy-washy artsy things like creative disciplines like the arts, English literature and things like that. So where does it all sit for you with being a man?
So that's a very interesting question, actually. So I would say, I'm just trying to think. That's a really, I've never really thought of that because you talked about the kind of the idea of it being gendered. Um, I would say in terms of, so why I chose the theme of the book and that title was a lot of the themes, a lot of the things I was talking about were things that I think a lot of men, because we live in a patriarchal society,
Yeah.
are suffocated when it comes to talking about certain things. Patriarchy does kind of suffocate us and prevents us from talking about certain things. And even when it comes to relaying art, even before we mentioned before how the comparison I made between like being a poet and being a rapper, it's seen as being a rapper is a more acceptable form of
Yeah,
lyricism
yes.
than being a
That's so
poet. And there are certain themes that I'll talk about the concept of what is cringe and what isn't cringe. Because I think this I've had this a lot where there's certain poems that I'll read and people go, oh, that's so cringe, or it just doesn't connect with them.
okay.
um and which is completely fine. I think that's the other thing where we have this assumption that if someone likes poetry, that they like all poetry.
Yeah.
No, like I'm highly critical. Like there's certain things that I come across, I'm like, that's not for me. But I mean, I would never say it's bad. I just think it's not for me. It wasn't designed for me. And I'm sure there are many people out there who appreciate it and love those pieces. But I do think gender and the idea behind the kind of masculinity, what we're allowed to talk about, what we're allowed to talk about when it comes to mental health, what we're allowed to talk about in terms of our relationships with other people or
Mhm.
how we see the world. We're kind of not allowed to kind of talk about our feelings and how it affects us. I think in some aspects it's easier for kind of women to talk about certain things. And I kind of thought the idea behind the book would be to kind of open a conversation, start a conversation, and in a way for people to read certain poems and think, oh, you've articulated that in a way that I don't think I could have, but I was also feeling that too. Not that I'm saying that I need people to kind of agree or have the same thing, but I think, I mean, I'll come across poems where I think, wow, like you really articulated that in a way that I couldn't find the words for. Um, and I think a lot of men do suffer from being able to not articulate their feelings, or their observations, or just even be able to discuss with other guys
Mhm.
those observations because of expectations that they have on what they think they should be talking to, or what they're allowed to talk to, or what they think would make them appear weaker. I think there's that aspect again of kind of competition that from a psychological point of view. And I think art and writing and poetry allows people to kind of like in a way get the confidence to be able to have conversations and talk about certain things.
Completely. No, it's so interesting that you say that. And I think it's so brilliant that you did really open up this conversation for yourself. I can imagine it being pretty therapeutic, writing all these different themes that you've thought about all, your life probably. Um,
No, it wasn't. It was not therapeutic,
oh, was it
but
not? No.
no, but I mean, like there was good and bad that came from
Yeah.
writing it, the writing process, because again, it came down to, I think there's the big difference between writing poems for the sake of writing poems and
Yeah.
writing poems for the sake of a book,
And
because the book does need to have a structure, and I think that was, I mean, I never had identified as a page poet before writing it in a book. There's a lot of spoken word artists there who are like, oh, we're spoken word fully through and through. And in a way, it's sort of putting it through the medium of a book itself is like a completely different field,
mhm.
a completely different. And
Well,
I think
it's
in many
yeah.
ways, yeah, it was
It's
not therapeutic.
therapeutic. Okay, so it wasn't therapeutic for you, but it was therapeutic, I'm sure, for many men who read it and
Oh
thought,
yeah,
oh,
yeah, yeah,
wow, he
yeah,
said it to a T, and this is really useful for me to actually hear it from man to man. And I think you've shown how poetry and the arts can really help be that kind of equalizer and something, it's all about shared humanity, and you can really help be in that experience with someone without even knowing them, just because you can relate to their life story or themes
yeah.
within it. So I think that's really powerful with what you did with the book. And so just last question, because I think we're going to get kicked off from Instagram, but how did your like male mates and male family members receive it all?
Oh, God, sorry. It's charging, so it's like the charge is on the underside, so it just keeps flopping over. Um, I mean, a lot of them liked it. A lot of them did not understand it because they were just like, "Oh, okay, like what is poetry?" And it's just like, okay, how do I describe poetry to you guys? But a lot of the men in my life, a lot of the people I'm friends with, I speak to, family members, like they really enjoyed it. They sometimes would quote me back, which was kind of cringe as well. I wasn't expecting.
That's funny.
I wasn't
Yeah.
expecting that. But they say positive things. I think it's more a case of when you see someone in a field that they're not used to seeing. I mean, we talk about gender, but also kind of racial, in terms of the intersection between race and gender, and just the elitism of the arts world. There's not that many. Like I can name on my hand male Pakistani published poets. Um, so it's a very it's in a way it's a space that's not designed for you, which is another reason why we kind of came up with Gully. Gully is an organization that me and Nafisa and Rupinder, another a poet published by Verve, South Asian poets, um,
Amazing.
came together and were like, we want to create a space for South Asians because a lot of the art scene in this country is not designed for us, and sort
Yeah.
of well how do you maneuver that with forming to the ideals that are placed on you? So um, that's one aspect of kind of Gully. One thing I would say is if people could support that, that'd be really great.
Yeah, no, I was
Um,
about to say to you, like, kind of what are your final sentiments and, what do people want to look out for? Are there any other books on the cards, or has the pandemic and being a dentist, is that keeping you a bit too busy?
I mean, I'm writing here and there. I would hopefully like to release another collection in a couple of years. I mean, I look back at my first book and just think, as a writer, I think even though it's been only 2 years, I think where I'm at in terms of writing is very different to where I was back then. And that's one of the problems I think of writing something in a book is that as much as like I really love the book and there's poems now, what I find is that I'm a different writer. So
Yeah.
one thing I
Always
enjoy doing
evolves,
is
so.
actually, yeah, one thing I like doing is when it comes to performances is writing extra bits or sort of thinking, oh, actually, even though that piece is in a book, it was actually unfinished. So now I can write the second part of that. And then I don't know, I like that idea of it not being finished and it being sort of, even though it's in a book, it being a dynamic process
Mm.
and writing poems based on previous poems. So yeah, like I am looking to publish another book. I think I'm not going to give myself the limit of thinking, oh, I'll do it now. Or I think if I can publish it within the next 2 to 3 years, that
Mm.
would be good. But if it doesn't happen, again, there's no rush.
Mm.
I think it's one of those things where you kind of know when you're ready. And right now, I'm like, you know what, I'm in sort of the hibernation mode. I'm in the kind of working on it mode.
Yeah.
But a lot of art is, a lot of, again, what we see as work within art is also just experiencing and living life. That's all part of the writing process, is
Mm.
going and just living your life and sort of coming up, not even thinking about writing,
Mm. It's
but
like the
just
best,
sort of,
the best creations are mistakes. The best things happen when you're not putting that kind of huge pressure on yourself to think this is what I've got to do. When you take that pressure off, I think that's where, I mean, that's for me when I'm like creating art or writing. That's definitely
yeah, yeah.
when it comes to me. We've got someone saying, "Where's the best place to buy your book?"
Best place would be to buy from me, actually. But if you can't, for internationals, I would say to go on Amazon because it's a lot easier through the Amazon shipping to get it internationally than for me to send it out internationally. But if you're based in the UK, yeah, the best person would be for me. So you could just message me on Instagram. That's probably the easiest place to get to me. Or if you don't have Instagram and don't know how to, you can go onto the Verve Poetry Press website.
Amazing. Yeah, no, I mean, I just love what you're doing, Camille. I think it's brilliant that you have created something for a community to make things way more inclusive for all communities. I think it's so important that poetry is no longer viewed as kind of the white middle class man and has that kind of elitist association. So I think it's just brilliant that you've really opened it up from, coming from a clinical perspective as well. I think that's really powerful. So yeah, just been absolutely wonderful chatting, and can't wait to see what else you've got in store for us over the next few years.
Thank you, thank you. No, this is my pleasure, and I really want to have a look at all of your other interviews as well.
Yeah, no, they're really interesting because I'm trying to get as many healthcare professionals who have this kind of creative bug as well. So I had a brilliant guy, I think last week. I'm also losing concept of time. It could have been last week, could have been 2 weeks ago. I don't even know now. But he's a
Mhm.
filmmaker as well as a junior doctor. And then I had a junior doctor who's a photographer, a musician as well. It's just, yeah, amazing. Like all people have so many different talents, and we just shouldn't be pigeonholed. It's really good stuff. So yeah, give them a watch when you're not too busy being a dentist, really.
I will try my best. I'll try my best.
But yeah, thanks, Emil, and yeah, chat soon.
Thank you, thank you. Take care, everyone.
Bye.